On this edition of the Table of Content, we are joined by Dale Ahlquist, the president of the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton. We'll talk with Dale about what he does and a little bit or a lot about G.K. Chesterton. Stay tuned. That's coming up next right here on the Table of Content. Thanks so much for joining us for this edition of the Table of Content. I am your host, Albert Saenz, and we are joined today by Dale Ahlquist. Dale, thanks so much for being with us.
You're welcome, Albert. A great pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
So, Dale, I like to always give our audience, our listeners, a chance to get to know who we're talking to. And I don't know if your personal biography is extensive, but maybe you can give a brief synopsis of who you are and what you do.
Well, I run the Chesterton Society, which is based out of the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. It's been an organization that's been in existence for 25 years, and we publish a magazine, Gilbert Magazine. I've written 5 books on G.K. Chesterton. And also, I run what's called the Chesterton Schools Network. I started a classical Catholic academy some 12 years ago here, and it has now become a model for classical high schools used around the country. It's called the Chesterton Academies, and there's over 30 of these schools now in existence. So I'm involved with classical education as well as Chesterton scholarship and a lot of evangelization along the way.
Now, just for some clarification, when you say classical high school, that's sort of like the high school equivalent of like a Montessori-based education, right?
I would say there's a distinction between a classical education and a Montessori education, but it's certainly of a similar fabric.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Just for anyone out there who kind of is thinking, well, what does he mean by classical high school education? Okay, sure. Now, here's my big question. You've got a lot of Chesterton titles, I'll say, but why Chesterton? Why choose to be so involved with the man known as G.K. Chesterton?
Well, I started reading Chesterton almost 40 years ago, and it became a passion because when I discovered him, I found him to be one of the greatest writers that I'd ever encountered, certainly a deep thinker, a wide-ranging writer, but also witty and joyful and artistic, really the complete package, the complete thinker. And I was amazed by how no one knew about him. He was certainly one of the most famous writers of his time, and it sort of became a passion then to get people introduced to this unfortunately forgotten writer. Now, because he wrote about everything, my interests have also extended to everything, so that if it's about art or politics or theology or philosophy or theology, Chesterton had a perspective on it and a very complete one. And so that's why Chesterton, one of the greatest thinkers and greatest writers of the 20th century, and someone who I make it a point to introduce everyone to.
Do you feel, after spending so much time of your life reading him and also sort of promoting him, do you feel like your attachment to him is very sort of almost personal, even though your life comes much later after his?
You certainly become friends with a writer that you study deeply, and they become very alive for you, and they are very much a personal companion. When I read Chesterton, I let him read me.
Sure, yeah. I would like to imagine there are many people who would love to actually be able to sit down and, have a talk with Chesterton in today's age if they could. But I think since he was so prolific, it seems, in his writings, his thoughts, his commentaries, you can achieve just about the same thing. You can almost kind of predict what it is he would say on any particular issue of the day that we have today versus what he had when he was alive.
That's very true, Albert. He's very timely because I think there's something prophetic about his writing. But you make a very good point. Because he was so prolific, he did write about everything, so it's not too hard to figure out, well, what would Chesterton have said about this? We can generally get the answer to that question, and it's always delightful and usually right on the nose.
Well, I appreciate on the website for the Society how you have his quotes broken down into this plethora of, different topics, culture, art, religion, faith, marriage. It's like, well, let's see, what am I looking for? Just pick one and it'll be there.
Yes, and we keep meaning to update our quote selection on the website because we keep gathering a large collection that even would encompass more subjects.
Well, I had to go pick I had to go pick one quote. I had to go look for something. And this one is, I'm sure, one of his more popular ones, but I needed something just to throw out there so that people could know how quotable he is. And maybe they've heard a quote from Chesterton, but it's never been acknowledged that it was by him. And there's the one under Religion and Faith saying that the Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried.
That's a very masterful and very typical great Chesterton quote that, you hear a quote like that, you realize it's indisputably true.
It is. Yeah. Absolutely so. Absolutely. But we could take a whole program on just going over quotes, but we want to continue to give more breadth to his life than just his quotable moments. Now, I'm curious, you wrote this great sort of introductory piece, I'll call it, and you asked this great question on the website, who is this guy? And I'm more interested really bit in the question of how is it that we even have to ask that question, because we can give a good synopsis of his life, but why is it, and you do go on to answer this question, but if you can retell it for our listeners, why is it that we even have to ask the question, who is G.K. Chesterton?
It is astonishing. In fact, the title of the article used to be, "Who is this guy and why haven't I heard of him?" And for some reason, our web designer took the second part of the question off there because that is the funny line. Here's someone who is a major literary figure, world renowned, known everywhere. He's been translated, into dozens of languages. So he's well known in many countries, many places, and in many genres. He wrote, 100 books. He wrote thousands of poems. He wrote plays, and he also wrote some very famous detective stories, the Father Brown mysteries.
Right.
And yet you say G.K. Chesterton, and people say, who's that? And so I'll tell you my three theories of why he just fell off the face of the earth, why he went into an eclipse. Three different theories, and all of them are perfectly correct. One is the fact that there's an institution who's in charge of teaching these things. It's called our school system, and their job is to pass the great thinkers and writers of one generation to the next generation, and people are entitled and expected to learn about these writers and these great contributors to culture, and someone has dropped the ball in actually teaching them. So that's one of the main reasons why the last two generations haven't heard of him. He died in 1936. At the same time, Chesterton, was very much a jack of all trades. He wrote in all these different genres, and our institutions can't handle someone who doesn't fit neatly into one department. If he had only written poems and literature, he could at least be taught in the literature department. And But because his stories and his poems and his novels are only one fraction of what he wrote, and even they are philosophical in nature, they keep spilling out into other departments. And he does write about philosophy, he does write about theology, but not in the classic sense, but in a unique and fresh angle that is just unexpected. So he just doesn't fit into any category, in any department, and so that's another reason he's sort of fallen through the cracks. That's the second reason. But then the third one is I think the most surprising one of all, but it's actually makes sense. Chesterton, his books are a huge part of his writing, but actually only represent a fraction of his writing. The reason people knew him so well during his lifetime was that he was a journalist and a public speaker. And so they usually read him in the newspaper. That's where they were expecting to see the great Chesterton quotations. And that's why he was a household name, because here's what Chesterton said today. And when he died in 1936, Albert, he stopped writing.
Right, of course.
And that's really when most people stopped reading him, was because his books were just really a secondary aspect of his career. He was primarily a journalist, and the way people knew him was through the daily paper.
So, how is it though that I'm digging a little bit just to sort of be facetious, as they say. So how is it that someone though who wrote so much can just sort of be dropped upon his death in 1936, because, of course, he came out of stuff like weekly journals and newspapers and magazines, but yet we have writers much older than Chesterton himself, and they stopped writing after they passed on to the next life. It was, okay, their life is over. But yet we still, people know who that author is. People know who wrote that book. People have heard about him or her. Where's the difference?
Yeah, I think part of it is there was this break in the middle of the 20th century with World War II and the Holocaust and the darkness that descended upon the face of the earth, and that's where he immediately went into eclipse, because people, I think, for a while were not ready for the joyful message of G.K. Chesterton, his message of hope, and someone who really talked about the deeper meaning of things in a philosophy that was more traditional and less avant-garde and less depressing and less existential. And his philosophy was not welcomed in the academic circles. And when you get shut out of the academic circles, that's when the whole generation isn't going to hear about you anymore.
Sure.
And so that's really what happened there. When they stopped teaching him, and when people stopped reading him on a popular basis, but when they did not teach him in the schools, in the colleges and universities and high schools, that's when people forgot about him. But what's happened is he's made this revival outside of academia, and so he continues to gain a large following for a new generation. But there's very few schools that are teaching him. And he's starting to kind of ease back in, and they're starting to rediscover his writings. But it's happening from the ground up and not from the top down.
Well, that's good to hear. It's good to hear that there are small movements for the large man that was Chesterton, to help bring him back into the education system, even into society in general. I mean, I can admit, I have only become more familiar with Chesterton in this latter part of my life. My first introduction to Chesterton, I was in my early 20s, and there was a small Catholic liberal arts college in the city where I grew up, and we were making friends there. So we got invited to go over for a play by this guy named G.K. Chesterton entitled Magic. And I was like, I don't know who this guy. I've never heard of this, So I was completely oblivious. But we went, and they did their best, and they put on this fun play. And then that was it. There was no more Chesterton again in my life. That was it. And then here I am now on the breath of my 40th year, and in the past sort of 5 years, I've started to hear more about Chesterton and been more interested in Chesterton, if merely from the standpoint that he has such wit, and I appreciate a man with good wit. And I'm thinking, wow, there's a lot more to this man than a random play that I heard in my early 20s and then just sort of let it go. So I can appreciate the fact that the world is sort of sorely lacking in more Chesterton, but glad to hear that he is coming back.
Yeah, when I started reading him, Albert, like I said, about 40 years ago, there were probably 6 of his books were in print at that point. And now there's over 70 of his books are back in print. So there's one gauge to measure his growing popularity again. That's great.
So let's do this. Let's at the We Are One Body Audio Theater, we're big fans of Chesterton, and we've recorded several of his writings, and also some of the writings of his wife, Frances Chesterton. And given that we are in this Advent season, coming up onto the Christmas season, I'd like to try to talk just a little bit here on the latter part of this show about one of those poems, The Wise Men. So we're not going to have time to necessarily kind of read through the poem, but I'm interested really in kind of his take, we'll call it, on the wise men, because, in the first set of stanzas of the poem, you kind of get this sense of, it doesn't really sound like he's talking about the wise men as we know them, right? Because Scripture is sort of vague about them. You have the wise men who came from the east, and of course we're all familiar with the song, three kings from Bethlehem, but he really sort of puts them in a different light, sort of really like a almost perilous journey, this really important search. I was wondering if you can try to sort of give some more explanation behind that poem.
Well, Chesterton certainly loved Christmas, and so he takes every aspect of it and explores it creatively and imaginatively at some opportunity. But to take on the 3 wise men who are so rich in potential meaning, because we know so little about them, that's what's so great. Mm-hmm. And so you could do lots of different things with them. But he puts himself in their shoes, as it were, and yet their journey to find Christ, to find the truth, is a journey that we're all taking. So he puts us all in that same journey, and even though it seems to be starting to take place in an ancient setting, it also seems to be taking place in a contemporary setting. Amid the snow and the rain. And we are trying to find our way. Our way is plain, but it's so plain that we could lose it. We could lose our way. And he says, "We know all labyrinthine lore," which what a great adjective that one is. Labyrinthine. The lore, the stories that are about the twisting search through a puzzle, through a maze. Looking for the center of the maze and looking for the goal. But then he says, we are the 3 wise men of yore, and we know all things but the truth.
That's a great line.
It's a great line, yeah. So that is where it's the accumulation of knowledge without having woven together what all that knowledge means, and finding the ultimate meaning in all that knowledge. And so then the poem just starts to lay out the rest of the journey, and it's a combination of physical obstacles and psychological and philosophical obstacles as well. They're going through the snow and the hail, but they're also going through the darkness and madness of unmeaning, and the gods of violence took the veil of vision and philosophy. The serpent that brought all men bale, he bites his own accursed tail and calls himself eternity. That's a reference to the madness of an Eastern philosophy that is completely circular, completely returning upon itself, and he equates that with the serpent of the garden who bites his own tail, and just creates a mad circle with no breaking out and no ultimate arrival, anything. And then, of course, they're looking for a child, the child that was there before the worlds began, and the child that played with moon and sun is playing with a little hay. It's a great Chesterton paradox, a great juxtaposition, that the idea that the creator of the earth and heavens, the creator of the moon and sun, is suddenly a baby in a manger playing with hay.
I like that. I'm going to jump in. I like that because it's not until the very end, the second to last, so the third to last line, where he actually says God. Every reference before that is the child, the child, and so to put in our minds God only as a child, not to take away from the great creator God, but to help us sort of bring God into that childlikeness that is emphasized kind of in Scripture by the child in his public ministry. I really appreciated that, just to sort of take away for just a little bit from God, and say, okay, this is just the child, but yet to sort of keep the connection. I appreciated that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then there's these homey images at the same time, because here are these exotic personages, the three wise men, who are also known as the three kings. They have exotic resumes, as it were, and they're finding their way to a barn, to a stable. But it says that the house from which the heavens are fed, the old strange house that is our own. So it ends with there's a sort of homecoming. The paradox being you're coming home to a place you've never been before, and finding this comfort and hominess that is still strange. Chesterton, it's a theme he plays over and over again: the strangeness of one's home. Even though it's a place where you're welcomed and comfortable, but you also find it a place of wonder and yes, strangeness. And of course, the way you are moving in a humble way, but also it ends with, of course, the great victory and the great joy. As the last verse is, "Hark! Laughter like a lion wakes to roar to the resounding plain." It's hard to even bring such images into words. The idea of this breaking forth, and of after all the pain and the rain, there's laughter and light breaking forth, and the whole heaven shouts and shakes, for God Himself is born again. And that would be a good ending right there. But Chesterton does one more thing with the last two lines of the poem, which I think is the great coup of the whole thing. It says, "And we are little children walking through the snow and rain." So it starts with these wise men who are on the search, and it ends with us being children ourselves. and there's something glorious and innocent, and the fulfillment of the gospel. Unless you become like a little child, you don't enter the kingdom of heaven.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it is such a beautiful poem, and it is very rich in its sort of explanation of the three wise men. But it comes back, luckily, thanks to Chesterton's, I'll say, brilliance. It comes back to us, trying to sort of emphasize what we need to do ourselves, which is become childlike ourselves. Well, Dale, is there anything, like, if you were going to, as we wrap up here, if you were going to try to make a shout out for Chesterton, sort of like, hey, world, wake up and smell the Chesterton, what would you tell? What would you say?
Well, to take off from our last thought there, become like a child. Chesterton had a childlike wonder at the universe and at the world and at everyone around him, and that was what made him so charming and likable. People really enjoyed being in his presence. He was, I've called him an overgrown elf, and so there's this sense of goodness and innocence that is also balanced by a deep and piercing wisdom, and that's the combination really that we all are seeking to achieve. That we want to be smart about things, but we don't want to be snarky, and we want to be innocent about things without being naive. And Chesterton combines wisdom and innocence in a marvelous model that I think we can all learn something from. If people want to learn more about Chesterton, Albert, I certainly invite them to take a look at our website at chesterton.org. And I've written a number of books that are helpful introductions to his writing, because he is a lot to get a hold of because he was so prolific. But I recommend my book, The Apostle of Common Sense, or also Chesterton 101, Common Sense 101, Lessons from Chesterton. So those are good ways to keep exploring this really astounding gift to human thinking and human literature.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you heard Dale say it himself. If you'd like to learn more about Chesterton, a great place to start is their website at chesterton.org. If you would like to hear a recording of the poem that Dale and I talked about, The Wise Men, head over to our website at waobAudiotheater.org and look under the Poetry Patch, one of our programs, for The Wise Men. Dale, thanks so much for being with us on this episode of the Table of Content.
Well, it was a great season to do it. Very Chestertonian to be celebrating Advent and Christmas together.
Yes, I'm sure that Chesterton will be looking down upon us with great joy that we took up some time to talk about him during this current Advent season and the coming Christmas. So thank you so much for taking some time.
A great blessing for me. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, so glad to have you on board for this episode of the Table of Content. We hope that you will have a very blessed Advent, a very Merry Christmas, and Happy New Year. Until the next episode, be good, stay safe, peace.